Good afternoon, everybody. This is Mike Bartels. I'm the Chief Development Officer from Becker, LLC, and we're very proud to have great panelists this afternoon speaking about the successful strategies for tackling the challenges presented by COVID-19. Just as a quick reminder, if everybody can keep their phones on mute, they were being recorded, and if you have any questions during the process, please put them in the question box, and we'll be happy to answer them as we go along. At this time, I'm going to turn this over to Joseph Harraka, who's going to be our moderator for today.
Thank you very much, Mike. This is Joseph Harraka of Becker, LLC, and I am the co-practice leader of our firm's trucking and logistics group. I'm really proud today to serve as a moderator. We have a distinguished panel. It's a very timely topic. If you all recall, it was about a year ago today that the pandemic really hit. I was just discussing prior to the webinar with our panelists and with Mike, the fact that our firm actually went virtual starting a year ago today. And I actually was, looking at CNBC, and it was a year ago today that all the major stock indices, the Dow, the NASDAQ, and the S&P suffered over a 12% loss, which is one of the most historical losses in the history of those indices. And so we have a really timely topic in that we're going to be reflecting back on the last year and talking about some of the lessons that we've learned as an industry, and also looking forward and discussing what we can take from the last year on a going forward basis and navigating further whatever the pandemic has in store for us. And I want to briefly introduce our two panelists, and then I'm going to ask them to talk a little bit about their respective responsibilities in their job for the various employers before I start the discussion and ask them some questions. We have Lisa Yakomin, who is the president of the Association of Bi-State Motor Carriers, and also Bethann Rooney, who is a deputy director of the Port Department for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn this over to these two ladies, again, asking them just to give a little brief summary of their job responsibilities, and then I'm going to ask them some questions.
Great. Well, thanks, Joe. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. My name is Beth Rooney. I am the Deputy Director for the Port Department of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Essentially the number two person in the Port of New York and New Jersey, responsible for the staff that are overseeing all of the operations, all of the infrastructure development, the planning, the business development, the personnel, safety, security, environment, port efficiency, involved in all of it. And again, appreciate the opportunity to be here this afternoon.
Thank you, Beth.
All right, I'm up next.
That's right.
All righty. My name is Lisa Yakomin, and I am the president of the Association of Bi-State Motor Carriers. And we're a nonprofit membership group that represents the motor carriers, the trucking companies that pull the freight at the Port of New York or New Jersey. And my responsibilities, I wear a lot of hats. But the part I like best is the communication with the members, being able to speak with them and email with them and communicate with them on a daily basis and listen to their concerns, the issues that they have, and then communicate those concerns and those issues and their feedback to the other port stakeholders and keep that flow of communication going and tackle any emergent issues that might arise. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa and Beth, now looking back over the past year, the Port of New York and New Jersey seemed to have fared better than other ports in the United States when it came to navigating the operational challenges that were caused by the pandemic, despite us actually being here at the epicenter of the crisis from the beginning. Beth, I'd like you to start our discussion with your thoughts on this. Two questions. To what do you attribute this success on the part of the port? And are there any actions that the port had taken that you believe were the most helpful to the industry?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think what we'll talk about, and we could spend the entire hour just talking about that. But I think what's important to put into perspective is the processes that we put in place and the structures that we used are the reasons that we were so successful. And we're really proud as an entire gateway of what we've accomplished. And I think all of us would say that in spite of some really incredible adversity, have done a great job keeping the port open and operating. To put things in perspective for a moment, to understand just how much we went from the lows of the low, being 16.5% below our 2019 volumes in May of 2020, to as high as 23.2% above our 2019 volume in November. So when you think about that spread of activity and volume in a relatively short period of time, it required flexibility, it required adaptability, it required very strong communications, transparency, collaboration, coordination. All of the great Management 101 buzzwords were put into play in order to allow the port to continue to operate relatively well. None of us are saying that it has been without challenges and without problems and without inefficiencies. But when you consider what has happened, I think in other US gateway ports, we did really well. What happened at the outset is that the port and all of its supply chain partners were identified by the federal government and then subsequently, at least by the governors of New York and New Jersey, as essential businesses. The entire supply chain, whether it was the terminal operators, the trucking community, which Lisa will speak more about, the warehouse operators, and everyone else who supports it, made health and safety a top priority. We put together a number of extra forums in which we were regularly coordinating with each other, a weekly meeting with all of the key stakeholders. We had a special working group that was designed for ensuring that we had enough personal protection equipment in the region for all of our essential workers. We leveraged the Council on Port Performance that had been in existence for 6 years, that was designed expressly to keep on top of any anomaly in the supply chain and ensure that we could be resilient. We became metric driven, more so than in the past, needed to ensure, again, the health and safety of all of the workers, and in general, paid early attention to potential bottlenecks in the supply chain, whether that be with trucker supply, with chassis, with not enough hours in order to move the cargo, with dwell time, with the availability of warehouse space. So we could write a thesis on it, but that's at least the highlights.
Thank you very much. Lisa, how about your thoughts on those questions? I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that occurred to me, we talk about this pandemic and the coronavirus and what happened. And in many ways, this was unprecedented because we've never had to deal with a global pandemic before. But I think specifically to answer the question about why was the Port of New York and New Jersey perhaps a bit more prepared than anyone else for something like this, and why we were so resilient in the face of such adversity, especially being at the epicenter from the outset. I have to think back to something else that we all lived through about 20 years ago, which was the attack on the World Trade Center on September 11th. And there were a lot of lessons that came out of that. At the time, that was also an unprecedented event. And it deeply, deeply affected all of us at the Port Authority, of course. So many of us lost friends, colleagues, loved ones. There's a lot of similarities, I think, in what happened then and what happened a year ago. And it gave us, at the Port of New York, New Jersey, gave us that perspective. It helped us to understand the need to keep good communications right at the outset. We were able to hit the ground running because we had already established a foundation of communication and resiliency from 20 years ago that served us really well when this pandemic hit. So I think that's something that the valuable lessons that we took away from 9/11 really came to bear here, and we were able to bounce back and to employ those lessons that we learned once the pandemic hit. I think that's a big part of it.
Lisa, you are absolutely right. That is a huge part. We learned on 9/11, and we had to put that, to the test again, in the blackout, that affected the East Coast for several days. We put it to play in Hurricane Sandy, and we put it to play, in COVID, and we have continuously improved on that. But first and foremost, we had the platform and we had the relationships established. It wasn't the first time we were getting together to talk about managing a crisis.
Thank you both. I appreciate that. Lisa, I want to focus now specifically on the trucking and logistics industry and the lessons that were learned during the past year. Specifically, what were the positive takeaways from such lessons, and what do you think could have been handled better?
Ooh, okay. Well, those are some great questions. Well, I would say that the number one thing, I think one of the benefits was that it really it highlighted to everyone just how essential the port industry is to the supply chain. I think that folks in the public gained a deeper appreciation for the trucking and logistics industry once they got to the store and there was no toilet paper. All of a sudden, you start to think, okay, how does this happen? How do I get these goods and services right to my doorstep? And they realize just how important the role of truckers and the trucking industry is in their lives. So I think that was one of the takeaways and one of the lessons that was learned early on. The trucking industry at the port in particular, we have learned over the years that we have to be adaptable because it is such there's so many variables at the port. You have the impact of the freight volumes and the weather and the traffic and all of those things that come together, and you have to be able to adjust and pivot. And so that is something that we were able to work on. But the issues and the challenges that we had prior to the pandemic, once the pandemic hit, those were amplified. And so we realized that there were certain restrictions in place and challenges that we were already dealing with that became even more challenging under these circumstances. In the very beginning, there was this dip, as Beth gave you the statistics earlier of how the freight had slowed down quite a bit because of the manufacturing that had slowed overseas with all the closures. And then when the freight came back, boy, it came back strong. It was like a tsunami. It hasn't stopped. And there's quite a bit of challenge that is associated with that. One of the lessons that I think we saw was just how important workforce flexibility is for the trucking industry specifically. That's something that we've been talking about for years in terms of our driver workforce, the independent owner operators that we have. They afford us that flexibility to expand and contract the workforce as needed. So in times of lower volume, we're able to scale back. And right now, which we have all of this high volume of freight, we're able to ramp up our workforce. So that's another thing that I think a lesson or a takeaway that we have is just how important workforce flexibility is specifically for the supply chain and how important those owner operators are. So I think as far as the way we handled it, I think the things that we did right were keeping in touch with one another, the other port stakeholders. We're certainly not shy in New York and New Jersey about sharing our pain points and what's troubling us. But we also come from a place of mutual respect for one another. And I think all the stakeholders are so dedicated to rolling up their sleeves and pitching in and helping one another. And I saw a lot of that. And that's another thing that I think we did right this time around.
Yeah, and I would just build on that. It's that mutual respect and understanding. The supply chain, as Lisa described, is extremely complex. And I think what is it, Newton's third law? I don't know what it's a law of, but there's something about, every action, creates an equal and opposite, reaction. And what, we learn more and more about in events like this, when we're seeing a tsunami of cargo, we went from, the doldrums and, slow and steady to fast and furious, practically overnight. And what we learn, very quickly, is that the action of one sector of the supply chain, or the inaction of one sector of the supply chain, has reactions both upstream and downstream. And helping each other to understand why decisions are being made, how those decisions do impact folks that are upstream or downstream of where those are. Doesn't mean that decisions are reversed, quickly or automatically. It takes a lot of, discussion and a lot of, sometimes animated, discussions. But it helps. We need to, in order for the entire supply chain to work well together, we do need to understand, the effect of Newton's law on every decision that is made. So having those relationships and having a mutual respect and understanding for each other has helped, to address some of the issues, and we continue to address the rest of them.
Thanks for that thought, Beth. I want to, again, direct this question specifically to you, Beth. Looking forward with the benefit of the past year's experience now behind us, what operational and business-related adjustments do you personally believe should be considered by industry members or made by the industry, given the challenges that you still believe remain?
Yeah. So the biggest challenge of this tsunami of cargo, again, you have to put the numbers into perspective, and the numbers don't tell all the story, but in the last 6 months, we have done the equivalent of 8.8 million TEUs if you were annualize the activity. If you carry that out to where we would have been doing 8.8 million TEUs with our natural historic growth rate, we're doing the activity of 2026 right now. And we're doing the activity of 2026 without the benefit of 6 years to prepare for it, and without the benefit of the investment by all sectors of the supply chain and the changes in those operational measures. So if this is the activity that we are going to see going forward, we have to work quickly to catch up on what we normally would have been investing and changing and collaborating through policy and procedural changes, over the next 6 years as that volume ramps up. So, just the biggest example is I would say in operating hours. So typically the port is operating 12 hours a day, 5 days a week. The terminals have been very good at adding extra hours of operation, but it's not enough. So if we need to be operating additional hours in order to move this volume of cargo, the entire supply chain needs to be operating additional hours and have the capacity to do so. We hear, often that the trucks need a place to bring the cargo at 11 o'clock at night and at 3 o'clock in the morning, or on weekends. So the warehouses and distribution centers need to be open and available. Or there needs to be more secure parking in the region. And if there is secure parking, then the customer has to be ready and willing to pay the fees that are associated with a pre-pull and the parking. We don't have enough truck drivers. So again, if we are going to be operating the port for a full second shift, the truck drivers that we have today are not capable legally of operating the full day in which the terminals will need to be open. There needs to be additional longshoremen in order to sustain being open extra hours of work. And I can say just from the Port Authority, our staff, with the exception of maintenance, is generally, tapping out at, 6 o'clock at night, and we don't traditionally have people in on weekends, and I've had to bring people in on weekends for the past several weeks, and will, for the foreseeable future. So the entire supply chain needs to change operating hours, operating practices. We need additional staff and manning throughout the supply chain in order to handle that. And then, there are a series of business practices, as I was referring to earlier, that complicate those upstream and downstream effects that need to be addressed in order for the port to be efficient long into the future.
Thank you, Beth. I really appreciate that feedback. Lisa, having attended bi-state member meetings, I know that you keep your hand on the pulse of the various financial challenges that have been imposed upon industry members, particularly over the last year, not only during meetings, but through email contact and other methods of communication. Could you identify those primary financial challenges and talk to us about how the industry members have attempted to handle them?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot that's been challenging about this whole this whole pandemic, and yes, the financial impact has been significant on a number of levels. I think it started out at the beginning of the pandemic, where members were having to lay out additional costs for personal protective equipment in order to keep their staff safe, because staying home was not an option for our industry. We are essential workers, and it's not just the truckers, but it's also the office staff, the dispatchers, the folks who work in the yard. So we really had to ramp that up and make sure that number one is safety in our industry. That is number one for all the stakeholders, not just the trucking industry. And so that became a huge financial hit that everybody took, but it was well worth it, of course, because that is our number one priority. But that was a challenge in the beginning, having to procure the PPE that was necessary to continue operations and keep everyone safe. So there was that aspect of it. Especially in the early days when there was all sorts of difficulty securing those items at a decent price. Now the prices have come down, so that's been a little bit easier to deal with now. But keeping your staff working in those early days, when, as we said earlier, the freight volumes had gone down and there wasn't quite enough work to go around for the drivers. But we knew what was coming. It's like, we use that tsunami reference, but the water recedes and you can't be fooled, because once it comes back, it's going to come back in a big way. And that's exactly what happened with the freight. And so our members made sure that they did everything they could to keep their people working. They had folks splitting shifts. They had drivers coming in half day, but paying them for the full day. They took on that extra financial burden because they knew that would reap rewards in just a few months, and it sure did when they were able to retain their workforce. The challenges we're seeing now is that it is, as Beth said, we need drivers desperately, and we are trying to ramp up the workforce in a way that we didn't think it would need to be ramped up for several years yet. The levels of freight that we're seeing now, we were not expecting for several years, and so there has been this scramble by many of the port stakeholders, not just the trucking industry, but the labor in the maritime industry. We really need to hire more longshoremen. We need to get more truckers into this industry to handle these freight volumes. In some ways, it's a great problem to have, but it does present a challenge for us. And the other thing is that, the amount of freight that we have coming in has caused issues with efficiency. Because there are only so many hours in a day. We do have the workforce constraints that we have currently. We're trying to work on that, but it's not going to happen overnight. We can't ramp up our workforce overnight, even with the flexibility that we get from the owner operators. And so how do you handle that? One of the biggest challenges my members have right now are the restrictions on the empty returns and the restrictions on last free day. Having to get these containers, this large volume of containers, when space is at such a premium, return locations are getting full and there's nowhere else to bring them. These are causing logistical issues for our dispatchers to be able to figure out how they can plan out their day and how they can have enough drivers to move all of these boxes efficiently and quickly enough, in and out of the terminal. So when you can't move the containers within free day, there are fees that are assessed, the detention fees, the demurrage fees, and that's something that has resulted in all of this crunch of all this labor. Oh, I don't know if you can hear that. There's a train going by.
You can hear it.
Our rail
Intermodal.
yards are busy too.
That's
It's
cargo.
truckers. That was, I couldn't have planned that better. Yeah, but it's definitely it's cost us some productivity and efficiency with all of the crunch that we have. Everyone's feeling that pain of the warehouses being full, the terminals being full of containers, and the truckers are doing their best to pick up and drop off efficiently. But there are some things, as Beth had touched on, that we need to look at as an industry to try and ease that pain. One of the things our members are calling for, the extension of last free day, maybe not having it be only 4 days, maybe pushing it to 5 and 6, and giving them a little bit of extra room to move those containers in and out of the terminals, and perhaps waiving these detention and demurrage fees, particularly when the terminals are opening on a weekend. Let's say they're opening on Saturday, maybe they can ease the burden on those deadlines and push those last free days out a couple of days to give the drivers a little bit more breathing room. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking at. These are the kinds of financial burdens that we're facing. It's presented a challenge, but again, half the battle is identifying those pain points and then expressing to those who have the power to help us out and to work with us on easing that pain. And so that's something that the bi-state is trying to do for its members. We're very strong advocates with the other port stakeholders, with the steamship lines, with the marine terminal operators, trying to advocate for longer hours with no restrictions so that we can move the freight as efficiently as possible till we get past this period of extraordinarily high volume.
Lisa, I also want to now touch upon another area of what I believe to be one of your strong areas, your areas of expertise, and that is there any proposed legislation being considered here at the state level in New Jersey or at the federal level in D.C. that transportation firms need to be aware of and for which they need to provide support? I'm sure that the attendees of this webinar would like to hear you speak on that point.
Absolutely, there's quite a bit going on. The state of New Jersey, they've throttled back a bit on some of the legislation that was of concern to us in the last couple of years. But a lot of what's happening right now legislatively centers on that independent contractor model, which affects the trucking industry in that such a large majority of our workforce, our driver workforce, are independent owner operators. They function as independent contractors. And as I've said throughout this webinar, that flexibility that they provide has been more than ever, has proven to be crucial to our industry and crucial to the supply chain. So that is something that we need to protect. We also, of course, want to make sure that workers are protected, that no one is being exploited, that folks are in this business for themselves as independent contractors because they want to be, not because they're being forced to be. And so there's a lot of laws right now, both was on the state level and now it's intensifying on the federal level. There are laws that are taking a look at this independent contractor model and the definition of independent contractor. And unfortunately, some of the legislation that's moving right now, I believe takes the wrong approach. And it's an approach that is a little too heavy-handed and will result in what we saw happening in California. There was a law that was passed called Assembly Bill 5 that had a very overly restrictive version of the employee classification criteria that wreaked havoc there, and it had the unintended consequence of eliminating and or severely restricting the ability of anyone in any profession to be an independent contractor. And that's a huge concern. We need our independent contractors. I think we've established that. We need our owner operators desperately. And so any legislation that threatens our ability to utilize that independent owner operator model is dangerous to the supply chain. It's definitely something that we're concerned about. So there is a piece of legislation that just moved in the House of Representatives last week. It's called the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, or the PRO Act for short. Sounds awesome. Anything with the word protection in it sounds great. But when you actually take a look at what the bill does, it contains a restrictive version of the classification test, the ABC, they call it ABC, Employee Classification Test, the same butchered version of the ABC test that was in AB 5 in California was inserted into this bill. Most of the bill is about protecting the right to organize if someone wants to form a union, but unfortunately there are some provisions in there like that ABC test that are a fatal flaw for a bill like that. It did pass the House of Representatives, in part because I think that not enough of the lawmakers who were voting for it realized exactly what the ramifications were of that bill. They saw the good parts of it and they didn't fully understand what the ABC test would do. And so that's something that we've been working on at the bi-state ourselves, and also with our coalition partners across the country, to try and educate lawmakers on what the PRO Act actually does, and how, you know, the protections that are in it for workers, there are some important protections in there that need to be preserved. But first, we've got to have a long, hard look at that ABC test. And we need to acknowledge that it is outdated. It's from the 1930s. And the workforce has changed tremendously over that time period, especially in the last several years, with so many people working from home. During the pandemic, we saw a huge rise in the number of independent contractors, particularly women working as independent contractors, entrepreneurship amongst people of color, senior citizens also who maybe face discrimination in the workplace because of their age are turning to independent contractor work. So it's more than just the trucking industry that is affected. But of course, from where I'm sitting as a representative of the motor carriers, that is my primary concern, is making sure that we keep the supply chain moving. 77% of our driver workforce are independent owner operators. That is huge. And so we need to speak to your US senators, anyone on this call who wants to know what can I do about the PRO Act. It is moving to the Senate, and you may see some articles that claim, well, it'll never get past the Senate with the filibuster. There is already an effort underway to try and eliminate that filibuster rule, in part to be able to push through legislation like this. So I truly believe that our senators need to be made to understand what's in this bill. It changed from last year when it passed. There's been more provisions added that make it even worse. So you need to call and email, reach out to your senator and speak to them about the PRO Act and how there are provisions in the bill that they need to take a second look at and truly understand the ramifications of what the bill would do to the independent contractor model in all professions, not just trucking. So that's the number one concern that we have and what we're working on in terms of advocacy. The other one is, the previous administration did take a look at the Fair Labor Standards Act and the definitions of independent contractors, and they acknowledged something that's been debated about for the last several years, that the definition of independent contractor has evolved and changed over the years, and it needs to be modernized in order to adapt to the current workforce, so that we don't inadvertently misclassify anyone that is truly an independent contractor. And so they came up with a proposed change, a clarification to the Fair Labor Standards Act that was actually pretty good. They did a good job with the economic realities that they added to it. They modernized the standard, and that new rule change was supposed to take effect last week. And unfortunately, a new administration came in and decided to take a second look at it, and that's fine. That's obviously their prerogative to do that. But they decided to at first put a freeze on it, and they asked for public comments as far as what folks thought about putting a hold on this rule. They said, let's take a look at it. Let's make sure it's the right thing to do. There was an avalanche of public comment. We commented, many others in the port industry and other industries throughout the country weighed in and said, no, that they actually did a good job. This proposed rule change is a good thing. Unfortunately, they went ahead and decided, no, we're going to freeze the rule anyway. We're going to think about it some more. And then last week, they announced that they're just going to pull the rule entirely and perhaps try and come up with something better on their own. So if folks want to weigh in on that, it's they have until April 12th. We're going to have information up on the bi-state website that you can point to give folks more information as to how to reach out and put forth a comment on this for the U.S. Department of Labor, but just to let them know that the Fair Labor Standards Act proposed rule change that was put forth by the Department of Labor last year, they did a good job. assessing what needs to be done. And it is something that we support strongly. It will help independent contractors across the country, including the trucking industry. And it's, you know, if we can weigh in before April 12th, perhaps they'll listen to us this time. So those are the two things you can do, really stay engaged. And the third thing I would say for anyone on this call is to get yourselves good counsel like Becker Legal and folks who stay on top of these issues. I really have to give you guys credit for how engaged you are in our industry and keeping on top of things and the level of communication you have with folks. We really appreciate you getting the message out there and amplifying these issues for people to keep them apprised of what's going on. So kudos to you for that.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if I could add one more thing, you know, to that list that Lisa so eloquently speaks about, and while I can't, you know, advocate for Becker, I can advocate for those of you on the line to also pay particular attention to the Drive Safe Act. The Drive Safe Act would allow for a pilot apprenticeship program to be established so that drivers younger than 21 would be able to operate in interstate commerce, which also includes the international, you know, cargo transportation system. You know, the Department of Transportation last year, you know, had gotten far in terms of being able to establish a program to do such a thing, and then it was halted by the current administration. So Congress has picked up and introduced just within the last couple of weeks a bipartisan bill that would allow for the establishment of a driver training program. And I think we can all say from experience, you know, by the time you're, you know, 21, 22 years old, if you haven't, you know, established yourself in a career at that point, it may be too late. So when we think about the aging workforce, when we think about the growth in truck drivers that we will need in order to handle the volume, not just in the Port of New York and New Jersey, but around the country, being able to capture, you know, young men and women, I would say, to get behind the wheel of a truck is important right when they come out of high school. And we certainly all understand the risks and the safety concerns and the insurance concerns of doing so. But, you know, we think that at least within our immediate area, where there are trucks that could service the port and do that first trip, you know, outside of the port, and then maybe a more experienced driver to do the longer haul would be important. So the Drive Safe Act is also something that we would like people to pay attention to and advocate for.
Yeah, I think that's very important because, as we said, we need drivers here at the port, and I think, you know, when it comes to the drayage industry, it is considered interstate driving, but these guys are making these short little trips, just a couple of miles here and there, and it seems unfair that you have, you know, there are larger states like Texas where you can, right now, you can have an 18-year-old driving a truck hundreds of miles within the state of Texas, and it's fine, but they can't drive a mile from a marine terminal to a warehouse here in New York, New Jersey, because it's considered interstate trucking here at the port. So that's why we think that this is a common sense approach to providing not just an opportunity for increasing the driver workforce, but it's a pathway to a career for these younger drivers, these 18, 19, 20-year-olds who, if they were in the Army, they would be behind the wheel of a tank, but you can't have them drive a truck at the port. And also, I had one of my members tell me that another advantage is the younger you can get these guys into the port driving training programs, the safer they will be, the safer a driver they will be. So it definitely makes sense to pursue programs like that, in particular for the port industry, for the drayage industry.
Before we leave this topic, we have some questions coming in, and I should have mentioned at the inception, and I apologize to the attendees, that there is a chat button that you could use if you have any questions. We're hopefully going to have some time at the conclusion of the discussion to answer any questions you have. And of course, to the extent we can't get to your questions or you have some questions after you digest the entirety of the presentation, you can always reach out to Lisa, Bethann, or me. But Lisa, we have a particular question I think is relevant to this topic, and rather than wait to the end, I just want to raise it because perhaps you can kind of just build on it and clarify the points you made about the PRO Act. But we have a question as to whether or not the New Jersey senators, Menendez and Booker, understand the ramifications to New Jersey and the trucking and logistic industries with respect to the PRO Act, and your thoughts on that, and whether you've had any communication with either of the senators and their offices.
Well, yes, we've been in very close communication with our representatives. I can say specifically just a couple of weeks ago, I had a very long meeting and conversation with Senator Booker's office to ensure that they do understand how important it is for them to represent the interests of New Jersey and to speak up on our behalf. As I said, what's complicated with the PRO Act, and Senator Booker is a co-sponsor of the PRO Act, and that's why it's all the more important for him to speak up and advocate for us about the more problematic aspects of the bill. I think it's important to point out that there are aspects of the PRO Act that are helpful for workers, that do help close some loopholes and some barriers to those in the workforce who do want to organize and try and strive for better workplace conditions. And those are the kinds of reforms that, obviously we support as well, and so that's something that's important to Senator Booker. But what we need to do, and we are in communication with his office and with Senator Menendez to make them understand that what's happening with the PRO Act, that there were things added, provisions were added to the bill after many of these lawmakers signed on as co-sponsors that I don't think they fully understand will happen if this bill is put into place. I know that one of the things that's been said, one of the counterpoints that's been said is that, oh, well, the PRO Act only affects the National Labor Relations Act, and it only will come into play, the definition for independent contractors will only come into play if they want to union organize. That's it. It doesn't affect wage and hour. So there's nothing to worry about. And that's simply not the case. And that's not just me saying that. There are labor law attorneys and experts and employment law experts who are much smarter than I am on these things and that have looked at the bill, see what it's calling for, and have confirmed that this will absolutely affect independent contractors. And our feeling is that the ABC test, pure and simple, is just outdated. It does not serve the modern day workforce, and it has no business being inserted into this bill the way that it was. It's really a shame because it just takes away from all of the other good aspects of the bill. And so, yes, we are in communication with our representatives. I also communicated with the folks in the House of Representatives and their offices, and we've been in touch with the sponsors of the bill in both the Senate and the House, and trying to have them understand that all of these consequences we're talking about, they're not theoretical. We saw some very similar consequences that happened in California with AB5, the direct result of having that ABC test inserted into legislation. So that's really the culprit here. I think we need to really make sure that everyone understands that this is something that needs to be taken a look at, and we need to improve. I think there's a lot of common ground. I think folks agree. You saw by the fact that the Department of Labor is looking at the Fair Labor Standards Act and looking at modernizing the classification criteria. I think that's one thing everyone agrees on, is that the existing criteria doesn't serve the modern day workforce. So let's start there. Let's start with the common ground, and let's move forward in a way that allows for independent contractors to exist going forward, and also allows workers who want to organize. So that's the messaging that we're trying to put out there. And yes, we have been in communication with our congressional leaders, and I will continue to do so.
Thank you. Beth, I'm sure that the attendees of this webinar would appreciate getting some of your insights as to whether there's anything that industry members can do to assist the port in securing federal or state support for the operations, and what specific support the port is seeking at this time. Can you provide some insight to the attendees on that?
Sure. We're always, seeking federal and state assistance to support a number of our programs. I would say the most significant right now is with regards to what we call the Port Street Corridor Improvement Project. Those that are familiar with the port, particularly Port Newark and Elizabeth, there's essentially two ways in and out, and maybe part of a third on Doremus Avenue. But the Port Street corridor was, created, back in the 30s and 40s when the U.S. Navy was operating the facility there, and long before containerization was envisioned, let alone, grown to the levels that it is right now. So we intend, and we have a design, and I expect that we're going to put the bid documents out on the street later this year. So we intend to completely rebuild and expand the capacity, improve the safety, and improve the efficiency of that corridor, that main entrance egress point on the north side of the complex. We're applying, in fact, our application will go in tomorrow for an infra grant. The Bi-State Association has been a huge supporter of our initiative to secure additional federal funding for that project. We have gone after both the state and federal delegation to support that as well. We'll be pursuing, other federal grants if by chance we're not successful with this infra grant. We know that there will be grant opportunities in the future put out by the U.S. Department of Transportation under the BUILD program, as well as a relatively new program called PIDN. Each of those programs allow for infrastructure and intermodal capacity within the region. And then there's a number of environmental programs. We have been successful over the last decade in leveraging federal grant funding to help truckers replace their trucks. We've also, with newer diesel engine models, just within the last couple of weeks, we have been successful in working with some of our marine terminal operators and trucking partners to leverage the Volkswagen settlement funding in order to begin to electrify their fleet. Now, we understand that that's certainly not something that is achievable for that 77%, which is just the New Jersey number of independent owner operators that are working in the port. But somehow we're going to have to bridge that gap in the future, and we're going to need a lot more funding in order to do that, as the state of New Jersey, the Port of New York and New Jersey move towards a zero emission supply chain. So right now, the industry is supporting us through Lisa and Tom and the Bi-State leadership in providing letters of support for our grant applications. We'll continue to ask for their support in doing that, and I know I can count on it.
That's great. That's great. Lisa, this is a question that I had planned on asking you, but we also got a question in from one of our attendees, as a follow-up to your explaining the communications that you've had with the elected representatives, and that is, do you have any thoughts as to how industry members can secure the support of their elected officials at this time to assist the industry? Not only just with respect to the PRO Act, but with respect to anything else that could perhaps aid the industry in navigating these operational and financial challenges that they're facing now and in the future.
Yeah, well, I think, one of the most effective things you can do is to open a dialogue of communication with your elected officials. What I have seen, across the board, they want to hear from their constituents. They do take their job seriously. They're in this because they want to represent the people of their home district, and they are committed to doing that. So one of the things that you can do is to look up, we have a lookup tool that we can share that you can send out with this webinar. I'll post it on the Bi-State website. But you look up who your representative is and reach out to them and tell them, lead with, I am your constituent. I live in your district, and this is important to me. This is how I am affected. You know, tell them, make it personal. I know that, you know, there are letter writing campaigns. We do that ourselves with our Bi-State members. We have these calls to action, but I always try and encourage our members to personalize it, to really, you know, add in a few sentences that explains how this affects you. And I think that is so important with our representatives in particular. One of the things we try and highlight is just how important the port industry is to New York and New Jersey. This is a $9 billion revenue generator annually, federal, state, and local taxes. Over 500,000 jobs in the region are generated by the port industry. That's tremendous. And that is something that I think perhaps folks need to be reminded of, that just how important it is. So I would say when you're reaching out, don't be shy about reaching out to your lawmakers, because they do want to hear from you, and they need to hear from you. Because unfortunately, you know, the way things work, especially in Washington, D.C., whoever has their ear is going to get results. And, you know, there's a lot of lobbyists out there that are, you know, knocking on their doors and trying to give them information. And there is no substitute from hearing from real people. We did that here in New Jersey. We saw that in action. Back in December of 2019, there was a bill that was working its way through the New Jersey state legislature that would have severely impacted independent contractors and would have eliminated our ability to have owner-operators at the port. And we showed up in Trenton in force. We reached out to other stakeholders, other groups of freelancers and independent contractors, and we all showed up from all different professions, not just trucking, but we had a great response from drivers in the port area. They came down to Trenton with their trucks and showed up and testified in English and in Spanish to the labor committee there, and it made a difference. It stopped the bill. It got the state of New Jersey legislators to take a second look at what they were doing and maybe throttle back and realize that this was a more complex issue than anyone had previously realized. So you can make a difference. You absolutely can make a difference. I would say don't be intimidated to reach out to your folks in Congress and your state legislators and ask them for their help and make it personal. Tell them how this affects you.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa, to wrap things up for our presentation, I just am curious if you can share with the attendees at the webinar what the Bi-State Motor Carriers Association has done for its members to assist them in addressing the various challenges you and Beth just spoke about that were imposed on the industry during the past year, and what does the association plan doing going forward this year?
Well, you know, it's funny when you ask that question. The number one thing that came to my mind is that I can't wait till we can see our members again in person. We haven't had an in-person meeting in over a year, and I miss these, you know, the men and women that are members of the association. So I can't wait to actually be able to meet with them again. So that's something I'm looking forward to. But as far as what we've been doing over the past year, we have kept the lines of communication open. As far as we have our meetings have been online. We've been doing them via Zoom, and I have to say we've had some really good participation. I think we're going to continue doing that going forward, even when we are able to meet in person. I've had several members ask me if we can continue to also streaming the meetings at the same time because it does make it more accessible to a greater number of people. We have also worked hard during this pandemic to try and identify trouble areas and pain points for our members and address them on their behalf. You know, there's been some issues with red tape. You know, certain government offices have had to be closed. There's been roving closures of the motor vehicle offices because of COVID. And so, you know, as far as different renewals that have had to happen for different members, license renewals and things of that nature, we have helped them troubleshoot. We've been working very closely with the different departments down in Trenton. They've been very helpful. The Department of Transportation has been great. Department of Labor has been great with helping us out with troubleshooting. So that's something we'll continue to do. I also have to give a shout out to the Port Authority for working with FEMA to procure masks, face masks for the trucking industry. That was something that we did last year. The Port Authority is able to get, I don't even remember how many you guys got. It was a lot of boxes, Beth. My
Several
goodness.
100,000.
Oh my goodness. You don't realize how much several 100,000 is until you have to unload it off the back of a truck. But we had lots of face masks that we were able to distribute to our membership. And so that was something we were happy to do. We're also continually working with our members to understand the challenges, the operational challenges that continue, that persist, ones that have arisen as a result of the pandemic, ones that existed prior to the pandemic that have gotten worse, that need to be addressed. And we continue to be their voice. We are the unified voice for the motor carrier community at the port. And we work with government agencies like the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, with our state lawmakers, our federal lawmakers, and with the Federal Maritime Commission. They have several investigations and fact-finding missions that they have right now where we're looking at ways to improve efficiency in the supply chain, and we are communicating with them and acting as a liaison for our members. So that's something that we will continue to do. We also are going to have our scholarship program ramping up this month. I actually am having it uploaded to the website today for our members. That's something that we try and do to encourage our members to stay with us and let us represent them. We're really happy to do that. It's something that, you know, the truckers play such a big role in our supply chain, and you know, they're great to work with. We're happy to be here for them.
Well, I really appreciate. Go ahead, Beth. I didn't mean to step on your line.
No. And I think if I could just add one more thing, you know, we, again, recognizing that the supply of drivers, you know, it's becoming difficult to retain drivers. It's becoming difficult to attract drivers, particularly when things are not running as efficiently as we would like them all to be. And we have heard about the big things, you know, that affect the ability to retain and attract drivers, and some of the and those are systemic issues. And then I think some of the other, you know, smaller but very important issues. So together with feedback from a number of the trucking companies, from Lisa, as well as a forum that the Port Authority held with a number of drivers, we've identified a number of issues that we're going to be tackling together with the terminal operators in terms of what we call driver experience. So Lisa and the bi-state members have been partners with us in what was our first driver experience forum with one of the terminals. We'll be setting up similar meetings with the rest of the terminal operators, you know, looking to address things, you know, like availability of restrooms, availability of vending services, communication when a driver might be stuck in a terminal for more than what is a reasonable expectation, particularly, you know, when it's late at night and most of the workers, you know, have gone home. You know, again, just more communication and transparency for the driver themselves, so that we can make their experience on the ground, or shall we say, you know, in the cab of their trucks, better, so that, you know, we can, you know, we don't want drivers, you know, saying the last thing you want to do is drive a truck in the Port of New York and New Jersey. What we want drivers to say is driving a truck in the Port of New York and New Jersey, you know, is a good experience, and, you know, a good, you know, well-paying, stable job that supports, you know, your family.
Absolutely. And we've also participated in lots of job fairs recently, and we've been trying to really spread the word in our local community, in particular in and around the port area. This is a great opportunity for folks, whether they want to be company drivers. We have so many motor carrier companies that are hiring right now, and not just drivers, dispatchers and office support staff as well, but primarily looking for drivers. So even if you don't have your own truck, if you can be a company driver, Or if you want to try being an entrepreneur and being an owner operator, there are tools and resources that are available to you, and the Bi-State can help you put you in touch with that. The Port Authority also has a workforce development team that's been extremely active in engaging with the community and providing those resources on how you can get started in getting your CDL and then where you go from there in order to work at the port. So, you know, our welcome mat is out. We want those drivers to come and work at the port. There's definitely plenty of work to be had. So we're happy to reach out to people and make them aware of the opportunities that we have at the port.
I'd like to thank the two of you. I really appreciate today's discussions. Industry members are really very fortunate to have you as thought leaders in the industry, the two of you. I can see that there's a lot of chemistry between you. It looks like you've known each other for quite a while.
Yeah, we generally like each other too.
Yeah, she's okay.
I would like to say to all attendees, thank you again so much for all your participation and willingness to attend. I thought we had a great session today. Should you have any other questions of Lisa, Beth, or me, Mike has put up our contact information here on the PowerPoint, and don't hesitate to reach out to us. We will circle back and definitely get back to you. Thank you again for everyone's participation, and thanks particularly to you, Lisa and Beth.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank
It's been
you,
a pleasure.
Joe. Stay well.
Out there. Take care.
Take care.